Presenters will discuss the findings of the first binational report on groundwater science relevant to the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement and present draft priorities for groundwater science and action for the next 3 years. So with that, I'm going to invite Dale Van Stupfort, who's the section head of groundwater at Environment and Climate Change Canada, and Norm Graneman, recently of the U.S. Geological Survey, to take the stage for their presentation. Thank you.
I don't have to tell you that the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement is about the water quality of the Great Lakes. Why does this agreement have a groundwater annex? Well, in fact, it hasn't always been that way. Since the original Canada-US Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement was drafted and signed in 1972, there have been many changes. One of the significant and visible changes is that there has been a growing recognition of the importance of groundwater. As we will review in the next few slides, groundwater was first included in the agreement in 1987, but in a restricted way. Since 2012, the agreement has taken a more comprehensive approach to groundwater. When the original agreement was signed over 4 decades ago in 1972, the two governments did not recognize the importance of groundwater. The focus of the 1972 agreement was largely on phosphorus loading and visible pollution. Why was groundwater not recognized in the original agreement? In 1972, very little was known about groundwater. Even less was known about how groundwater interacted with surface water and how it could be contaminated. The focus of the original agreement was on the water quality of the Great Lakes. Little was known about the complexities of the environment, including the various components of the water cycle that interacted with the Great Lakes, as illustrated in this slide. Groundwater's role in the water cycle in the Great Lakes Basin was essentially out of sight, out of mind. Up till that time, the focus of the very limited research on groundwater had been on its use as a water resource. Early studies of groundwater were not in any way linked to water quality of the Great Lakes. The 1970s was a decade of tremendous growth in knowledge about the environment. This included research on aquatic chemistry and toxic pollutants. In response to this new knowledge, the agreement was revised in 1978. The revised agreement focused a lot on persistent toxic substances. There was a new recognition of the Great Lakes Basin ecosystem. That is to say, it was now recognized that the Great Lakes interacted with other components in the basin, including the air, the land, living organisms, and other bodies of water. However, in the 1978 version of the agreement, the role of groundwater was still not recognized or addressed. But that same year, the Love Canal disaster made big headlines. Love Canal was an industrial site at Niagara Falls, New York, where toxic chemicals had been disposed. The site had been redeveloped as a residential area. In 1978, it was found that the waste chemicals were leaking and contaminating the soil and groundwater. As a result of this highly publicized incident, groundwater could no longer be ignored. There was now broad awareness that groundwater at developed sites, past or present, could be contaminated. Concerns grew quickly about how contaminated groundwater might impact the water quality of the Great Lakes. As a result of situations like Love Canal, the US EPA established a Superfund in 1980 to clean up contaminated sites. And we've heard about some of the outcome of that work earlier. In the following years, there was rapid growth in research on contaminated groundwater and on development of technologies to remediate plumes of contaminants in groundwater. How did this new knowledge about contaminated groundwater affect the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement? Well, when it was amended in 1987, an annex was added to address pollution from groundwater, from contaminated groundwater. This Annex 16 was focused on addressing the impact of contaminated groundwater at heavily contaminated sites on the Great Lakes. In this approach, groundwater was only recognized as playing a negative role. Groundwater was seen as a potential transmitter of contaminants from specific sites or point sources that could negatively impact the water quality of the Great Lakes. The amended agreement included reference to non-point sources of pollution for the first time, meaning widely distributed sources, not limited to a specific source or a single site. But no specific connection was made between non-point sources and groundwater at that time. In 1987, there was almost no appreciation for the complex interaction of groundwater and surface water, which were still usually considered and studied as two separate systems. Another event that resulted in wide awareness of groundwater contamination issues was the WALKERTON tragedy in 2000. You probably remember what happened. E. coli bacteria from a farm contaminated shallow groundwater that was used as the water supply for the town of WALKERTON, Ontario. This resulted in widespread sickness and 5 deaths. I should point out here that the WALKERTON tragedy was not about water quality of the Great Lakes, but about quality of groundwater in a specific aquifer in the Great Lakes Basin. But a broader outcome of this tragedy was a much greater awareness about the vulnerability of groundwater to contamination. This led to programs such as Ontario's Source Water Protection Program. What has been the result of this growing awareness about groundwater contamination? There is a clearer understanding of the vulnerability of groundwater to a wide array of different harmful substances. There is consensus that we need to protect our groundwater resources. The potential sources of pollution are not just industrial sites. They include widely distributed contaminants, such as fertilizers and pesticides applied in agricultural and urban areas. It would be wrong to assume that groundwater only has a negative role to play in the Great Lakes Basin. In fact, much of the base flow in streams is derived from outflow or seepage of groundwater. A recent study by the U.S. Geological Survey and Environment and Climate Change Canada showed that in many streams in the Great Lakes Basin, base flow makes up the majority of total stream flow. Much of this base flow is derived from seepage or discharge of groundwater. In other words, groundwater seepage supplies much of the water to the Great Lakes. Groundwater discharge also supports diverse aquatic habitats in streams and wetlands. Much of the groundwater discharging to streams is clean. Clean groundwater is an essential positive contributor to good water quality in the Great Lakes and in tributaries flowing to the Great Lakes. Knowledge about groundwater is constantly expanding. Currently, much research is focused on the complex interaction of groundwater with surface water. For example, as shown in this diagram, flow between groundwater and surface water happens in both directions and changes with the seasons and during storm events. Also, when contaminants are being transported by groundwater through the subsurface, they are sometimes degraded by bacteria or adsorbed to solid particles such as clays. In this way, the passage through the groundwater loop of the Great Lakes Basin water cycle can sometimes remove or trap harmful substances. In 2012, Canada and the United States had the opportunity to take a new, more holistic approach to groundwater. Both the negative and positive roles of groundwater could be recognized. the complexities of the water cycle could be taken into account, such as the variable interactions of groundwater with surface water and wetlands. Canada and the United States have responded to this opportunity. The 2012 revised agreement does take a new, more holistic approach to groundwater. A new Groundwater Annex, Annex 8, was incorporated into the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, completely replacing the previous annex on pollution from contaminated groundwater. The focus of this Groundwater Annex is on understanding the impact of groundwater on the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the Great Lakes. Given the interconnected nature of the water cycle and the ecosystem in the Great Lakes Basin, establishing this new Groundwater Annex is important for the long-term protection of the Great Lakes. The focus of the new Groundwater Annex goes beyond just addressing the impact of contaminated groundwater on the Great Lakes. The new annex better reflects the broader challenges and potential future impacts facing the Great Lakes related to groundwater. The 2012 agreement addresses groundwater as an essential and major component of the Great Lakes system, and not only as a contributor to contamination of the waters of the Great Lakes. If we were to break up the text in this new Groundwater Annex into its simplest components, we'd find that this annex is all about two things. First, it is about enhancing our knowledge of how groundwater affects the water quality of the Great Lakes. This includes getting a better understanding about the groundwater information gaps and science needs. Secondly, armed with this information, this annex is about coordinating activities on both sides of the border to protect and manage the quality of groundwater. And with that, I'll turn it over to Norm.
Thank you, Dale, and I think we all need to thank Dale for his leadership on Annex 8 and pulling together the report and working on the indicator and the priorities for action related to groundwater, which are the three topics that I want to talk to you about in the second part of this discussion. So you can see on this slide that that this is divided into a section on how the Groundwater Annex Subcommittee was formed, the beginning of the report on the state of science of groundwater, and we really felt, I think the annex itself even indicates that people really don't understand groundwater well enough. And so that was the purpose of this report, which we finally got done, largely due to this guy right over here. Got done in late 2015, and it is now available on binational.net. In addition, we have worked some on the indicator. We formed a groundwater indicator task team in 2014, and as you noticed this morning from Nancy and Jackie's report, that we actually have some information to report there. And so I'd like to talk about that in a minute. But starting with the report itself, here is the cover of the report. It is an odd cover given the fact that it's a picture of a bluff at pictured rocks in Lake Superior, but the staining on those rocks are from groundwater discharging down the face of the bluff into Lake Superior to identify the fact that groundwater really does flow both directly into the lakes in a situation like this, and indirectly, as Dale mentioned, as groundwater seepage to streams, constituting over half of the tributary discharge to the Great Lakes, therefore the connection between groundwater and surface water. Of course, and it's, if you many people, because it's out of sight, don't recognize how important groundwater is. But if you think about what our life would be like if no water infiltrated the earth and became groundwater, all that water would have to go somewhere, and we'd have a lot of water we would have to deal with that now is dealt with by the groundwater system, by infiltrating water into it and moving through the groundwater system. In general, that has not been, groundwater was important more in drier areas of our two countries. And so a lot more study has been made of groundwater in drier areas. And as a result, we kind of came to the table a little bit late on the importance of groundwater in our wetter region. And in the southwestern United States and in parts of the western Canada, there is not as much infiltration and is not as much interaction between groundwater and surface water. But here, it is really the dominant thing. And so we spent a lot of time on this report talking about groundwater surface water interaction. The other reasons, of course, that groundwater is important is there's a lot of it. As mentioned earlier this morning, there's a volume of as much as 2 Lake Hurons worth of water underground in the Great Lakes Basin. Approximately 1 on the U.S. side and 1 on the Canadian side. I don't know that we can, we don't know those numbers accurately enough to say that exactly, but that's the general feeling. And then the other important thing is that it sustains flow in streams, which we've already said a couple of times. And unfortunately, when it becomes contaminated, it takes a long time for it to get uncontaminated. And Dale and I have both worked on sites going back as far to the 80s that have been under remediation since the 80s and are still not cleaned up. So if that's any indication of how long some of this repair takes, I think we should think about that. The report, I'm still talking about the report, by the way. The report considers many multidisciplinary issues, and I'll quickly mention them. I've already mentioned groundwater surface water interaction. I don't think we need to talk about that much anymore, except that it really is the dominant theme of the whole report. Secondly, groundwater contamination. Again, we've talked about contamination from point sources. Some, we mentioned Love Canal, we mentioned WALKERTON. Those are point sources of contamination. And we're especially worried in this report about non-point sources of contamination. So there's a fairly comprehensive chapter on that and how that's dealt with. Groundwater and nutrients is another important thing. We really do not have a good handle on how much of the nutrient flux to the lakes actually originates from the groundwater system. And that's something that we really have to work on a lot more. There is some research going on both sides of the border about this issue, and is a very important one, has important management implications, because while the water may be delivered to the lakes via the tributaries, it gets to the tributaries via groundwater. And if it takes so long to clean up groundwater, that means there are big implications for how we deal with some of these issues. Groundwater and habitat, I think Dale has already mentioned that significantly. I'll just say that if you're a fisherman, you know where the streams are that have good groundwater flow. So that's important. One area that's really quite new, I think, and emerging is groundwater in urban areas. And those of you working on green infrastructure are very aware of this. You try to infiltrate as much water as you can in these urban areas. And that is definitely a plus. I'm not talking against infiltration into the groundwater system in urban areas for green infrastructure, but it does have contamination potential as well. And so this is something that's going to need some balance. We have to understand not only how much gets into the groundwater system, but how that could potentially change the chemical makeup of the water in that area. And then the last main chapter in the report is on climate change. Again, we discussed very briefly the fact that there is actually a base flow indicator that we haven't reported on yet, but certainly a base flow indicator is a good way to say something about climate change because it incorporates the integration of water moving to a stream over a long period of time and would be a good way to identify climate changes in the basin. And of course, all of you know that especially in the agricultural business, groundwater is vital to that, and how groundwater is dealt with in climate change conditions can impact the agricultural industry quite significantly. So moving on to the groundwater indicator, this kind of emanates from the report. We covered a lot of the information in the report that is reported in the indicator, but please remember that this really is an indicator, and I have to say it's probably a very simplistic indicator. So here are what we looked at was nitrate concentrations in water from wells around the basin and chloride concentrations in water from wells around the basin. And here are the points that we looked at on this map. There's actually quite a few of them, but we actually ended up eliminating a number of them because we wanted to only look at the shallow ones. And some of these are shallow and some of these are deeper. Some of the deeper wells have naturally occurring higher concentrations of chloride. In particular, those of you who are aware of some of the deep wells in the basins around here actually know that if you go deep enough, you'll pump brine out of them. And not only will you have a little chloride, you'll have more chloride than you know what to do with if you're not careful. So these networks are important. And again, on the indicator, what we were looking at is non-point sources of pollution. We recognize that there are many point sources of pollution, and this is something that we're going to have to work on in the future, is how to integrate the point source data with the non-point source data. But this indicator only talks about non-point source data. And to give you an idea of how important some of the point source data is, in the Upper Great Lakes study that was done a few years ago, I don't remember when it was finished, that Upper Great Lakes study identified 110 sites on the Canadian side and 214 sites on the US side that were of concern because of groundwater contamination. So how we can incorporate that into our understanding of their effect on the Great Lakes writ large is another big question. So, so here's, whoops, there we go. So here's the map that, was it Nancy or Jackie? I think it was Nancy showed this morning. And it was, when I first saw this, I was frankly a little bit shocked. Being a person who is very excited about groundwater and promoting its virtues, to see so much of the basin indicated as fair and and only one basin good was kind of a shock to me. So let me explain to you part of the reason for that. First of all, we use fairly stringent contamination amounts. And remember, this is looking at chloride data and at nitrate data. So for chloride, the standard we used for a pour was 120 milligrams per liter, and for nitrate, the standard we used for pour was 3 milligrams per liter. Now, those of you who work in the drinking water business realize that the standard for nitrate is 10 milligrams per liter, not 3. And for chloride, it's really more advisory, but it's 230 milligrams per liter on the US side, 250 on the Canadian side. So we use standards that were much more stringent because they are the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment standards. Now, you may argue that that's not a good standard. However, this is an indicator, and we don't necessarily want to let the horse out of the barn. We don't want to wait till it's 10 milligrams per liter before we raise some concern about this. So I think it's justified that we use these fairly stringent standards for groundwater as an indication of the state of groundwater in our basin. And again, I would love to hear your comments on this when we get some time. Just a little bit of zooming in on this. This gives you a little better understanding of the distribution of wells. We actually had more wells than this, but by limiting it to shallow wells, that reduced the number that we had to deal with to some extent. And it really points out the need for more information about this. So we kind of look at this as a preliminary snapshot. It's the easiest thing that we have. Oh boy, Carla says I need to hurry, and so I will. So the next slide is, there we go. So on that cautionary note, I think we want to just kind of emphasize something that Dale also mentioned earlier, and that is that we need to coordinate our management actions related to groundwater much more stringently. They're much more accurately and better than we have in the past. And in this case, I think we're going to be looking to the states and provinces to help us, because that's where the management actions really kind of take form. And so we're looking forward to the next steps being led largely by those groups. I did want to point out, if you can read this real quickly, a few things that have gone on successfully on the domestic side, and just real quickly, two of them you might note. On the U.S. side, Ohio State is looking at phosphorus in groundwater and how much it contributes to the Great Lakes, and the Ontario Geological Survey is also doing, and Environment Canada are also doing something similar, especially in the Lake Simcoe, Georgian Bay area. So I won't talk much more about that. I would like to mention, however, that this report from Southern Ontario about ambient groundwater geochemistry is an excellent report, and is, I think, maybe a guideline for how we might organize our monitoring networks basin-wide. It's quite well thought out, and I would, if you have time and are interested in reading something like that, it can really move us forward a bit. And then real quickly, you might notice that when we talked about the groundwater indicator, we said there were no determinable trends. And we kind of don't have enough long-term data to look at trends. However, there was a report looking at trends from 1988 to 2010 from my organization, the U.S. Geological Survey, that included part of the Great Lakes. And you will notice that they too are concerned, as I am, that there is a bit of an upward trend, as noted by the large red arrows in the Great Lakes Basin, indicating that conditions are getting perhaps a little worse, and that maybe we ought to ramp up our work just a little more carefully, a little more completely. Now, finally, the last part, and I'll go through this quickly, is about our priorities for action, which also came from pretty much from the report itself. There are 7 or 8 of them in the report. Here's 3 that I thought maybe you might seriously think about. And since we emphasized groundwater-surface water interaction so much, and in spite of the fact that there is quite a bit of work going on in that area, we still need to have a better understanding of what happens to groundwater as it moves from the groundwater system into the surface water system, because we know there's a lot of geochemical activity going on at that interface between groundwater and surface water. And we need to understand that better in order to understand how groundwater is actually impacting the Great Lakes. The next priority focuses on assessment and known sources of groundwater contamination, and this relates to those several hundred sites that were mentioned in the Upper Great Lakes study. So we need to understand them better and how to incorporate that better. And then a third priority is, as you could see from the maps, there were some pretty big holes there, and we need to fill those holes with better monitoring systems, more complete monitoring systems. So that's the end of my talk. I want to thank Dale for all he has done. Thank you for your interest in groundwater in the Great Lakes. And I hope you agree we've made some progress, but we got a long way to go yet. And I look forward to your help in coordinating our work across the border and among the provinces and states as well, and local units of government also. And remember that groundwater can be thought of as our savings, our water savings account, basically. And so we need to protect it. Thank you.